The glycemic index, just what is it? And does it have any relevance to nutrition nowadays? So hopefully in this video, I'm going to run through exactly what the glycemic index was designed for, why it was around and how it pretty much works, and then talk a little bit about its relevance nowadays, or its lack of, if you like, in terms of people's nutrition, and the reasons why we know that now. So the index itself was designed by a researcher back in, I think, like the 1980s, as a way to kind of help out people like diabetics. So it was a measure of the amount of glucose in someone's blood over a period of 2 hours, I believe. So they were able to give someone, I think, 50 grams of carbohydrates or just under, and then they would monitor the spike and then for how long it took for that to come down. And the score, the GI score, was what was given to that food, for example, and that was where it was placed on this index, which probably at the time was quite useful for people like diabetics. But does it have any place for just everyday normal nutrition? So the reason we're doing this video is because we get quite a lot of questions recently around the differences between, should I use white rice or brown rice or potatoes or sweet potatoes, and just all of these small factors that really don't matter. So this video hopefully can kind of alleviate some concerns there. Now there is one big flaw in the glycemic index, that it only applies to when you eat that food on its own, so in isolation. So as soon as you start to mix other foods with it, like most people do when they have a meal, you're going to have some form of protein, carbohydrates, fats, and then when you throw into the mix the type of carbohydrates with starches and also fibre, all of these things are going to have a part to play in what happens to that reading, that blood glucose reading. So that is the major flaw that people seem to forget when they talk about the GI index, which kind of throws it all out. We also know that things like the amount you chew your food can have an impact on it, and also whether you add extra things like salt to your food intake as well will have a massive part to play. And also not to forget that the index, the scale, was built on 50 grams of carbohydrates. So if we're having more or less than that, then again, that's going to play a part in its outcome. Now, what really kind of put the glycemic index to bed was a study in 2015 where researchers wanted to really find out the validity of this scheme, this index to help diabetic people. So they designed a study where they actually used a monitor, a glucose monitor that was in the skin, a real accurate way of monitoring blood glucose, and they looked at other markers of where they could find, you know, the markers that they wanted with regards to blood glucose. And they did this in I think around 800 people, and then they correlated all of those results, and then they were able from that to try and get a grip on what kind of carbohydrates were being able to stimulate glucose to certain levels, and then they filtered that down again. And I think in the end they ended up with something around the lines of 12 participants, where they could try and almost formulate like an algorithm for blood glucose. And even then, they've kind of come to the conclusion that because people are so individual in terms of how they respond to carbohydrates, some people are very sensitive and some people are very insensitive. So they can't you can't plan something around that because of the individuality involved in humans' physiology. So at the end, the participants' postprandial glucose response, which is what they were trying to measure, was so different between each participant that they kind of had to come to the conclusion that it can't really, you can't put like there isn't a set way to do it. It has to be done on the individual in front of you. In summary, the glycemic index, to use that to base your nutritional diet intake of carbohydrates, or even try and base your body composition goals on, is really outdated. These studies go to show that, and also the fact that even when you look at comparing something from the glycemic index and then putting it with a mixed meal, you have a completely different effect on glucose. It just goes to show that unless you're eating these foods in that amount on their own, which no one does unless you're weird, you can't rely on an index like that. So where it might be of some use, and I even think now that the American Diabetics Association have said that even for diabetics it's not even a useful tool. You're better off looking at individually how you respond in terms of carbohydrates and the amounts that you're eating. So a real good way to do this would be to track your carbohydrate intake and to see how you respond. And then if you're doing that for body composition reasons, you might as well just track your food intake and look at your calorie intake overall. And we all know that calories are key when it comes down to losing fat, building muscle. So glycemic index, hopefully this has put it to bed now. But as always, if you have any questions on it, feel free to reach out, send me a message. I will always answer them.